official meetings. My name is Bill Smith, and I've had the opportunity to co-chair this group along with Chris Fisher. Today, Bob Gerst will be standing in for Chris. Chris became ill over the weekend and was unable to join us. We'll miss her, but we'll go ahead and get this done, and I'm sure she'll be pleased with the output of the report. First of all, let me remind everyone to mute their phones, and unless you're speaking, mute your line. Let me test or check the number of people we have on the call. I have Robert Bailey, Becky Berger, Paul Brennan, and Marcia Brooks. Are there any others on the call?
Yes. This is Craig Donaldson from Entrado.
Good morning. This is James Feger from CenturyLink, representing Dennis Huber.
Any others? Okay. With that, let me introduce Jeff Goldthorpe, the FCC designated federal officer, to officially open our meeting.
Thanks, Bill, and let me add my welcome to everybody. Thank you all for coming here today. It was nice out when I came in, and I think it'll be nice when we leave, I hope. Spring is going to be here soon. Thank you for all of your hard work, and we'll have a chance to say that many times today. But let me not spend too much time right now. I'm going to turn it right back over to Bill so we can get on with things. Bill?
Well, thanks, Jeff. This is a big meeting for us. I think most all of you have been involved in the work we've done so far. We kind of had a milestone and got halfway through our agenda with our last meeting and approved a number of reports. So far, we've approved 5 reports out of the 10. We have a very full agenda today. We have the remaining 5 reports to get voted out today, and without further ado, we'll get started with that. Bob is going to start the discussion on the first part of the meeting. Bob?
Thank you, Bill. And first of all, I want to, on Chris's behalf, thank all of you for all the work you've done. I know she's very sorry she couldn't be here, but as was mentioned, she became quite ill over the weekend. She's doing fine, but there's no way she would be able to travel from the West Coast, and I'll just be sitting in for her. Let me first review the agenda today. As Bill mentioned, we have 5 reports coming out today for vote. We have Working Group 2A, the cybersecurity best practices, 2B, the MSRC best practice update, 4B, the transition to next generation 911, 4C, the technical options for E911 location accuracy, and Work Group 6, best practice implementation. We've already heard from Jamie, so let's move on to, I'm sorry? Oh, I'm sorry. We heard from Jeff. Not
Bob, does that mean you've heard enough from me?
No, I really apologize for that. I skipped over that, and I would never skip over the Admiral, our friend. One thing, I guess, in the military you never do is skip the Admiral. Sorry, go ahead.
At least not twice. That's right. Bob, thank you. Appreciate it. And please accept my additional welcome to you. We always get excited when CSRIC comes. This being the final meeting, we're sorry to see it end, but this has been a tremendous time, a tremendous work on your part. I particularly want to thank Bill Smith of AT&T and Chris Fisher of APCO, who of course is with Norcom 911 in the Pacific Northwest. We're sorry Chris can't be here, but to you and to the steering committee chairs, Bob Gerst from APCO, Julie Thomas from AT&T, who was assisting Bill until recently, and her successor Liz Gunn, who was really instrumental in keeping us on track for this meeting. A little bit later, you'll, of course, the chairs of the 10 working groups, I think, will be acknowledged, but I really appreciate your leadership. I realize that this is a challenging responsibility that you've had, maybe even demanding, taking time away from you. We really do appreciate what you do and how people really dug in and worked hard in the working groups to examine these important issues that actually go into the policy making of the Commission. I know it wasn't clear sailing. I know that there wasn't always agreement or maybe even consensus. It sometimes does not come easily, but I appreciate you working through that for this important work. I think we can clearly agree that the work done through CSRIC is central to the FCC's mission and very important to the nation. And so we value your expertise highly and the time that you've devoted to recommending these critical things in these relevant areas. In previous council meetings, we've heard from and you have voted on recommendations regarding public safety consolidation, improving 911 and E911, introducing CAP for EAS alerting systems, priority service requirements, and ISP network protection practices. And the Commission has put these recommendations into work in many highly visible ways. Today we'll hear recommendations for the remaining 5 working groups addressing cybersecurity best practices, an update on Media Security and Reliability Council best practices, and transition to next generation 911 and technical options for E911 location accuracy, and recommendations on best practice implementation for each communications segment. We've been fortunate to have such a combination of talent and experience from a diverse professional group and disciplines on these critical issues, and once again I thank you for your service to the nation. I do also want to recognize the work of my staff who served as liaisons and resources to the working groups. Certainly to my left, Jeff Goldthorpe has been instrumental as your federal officer on this, but also would want to mention Jerry Stanshine, John Healy, Rich Hovey, Julia Tu, Brian Butler, Patrick Donovan, Eric Ehrenreich, Jane Kelly, Vern Mosley. Also, Jean Ann Collins and Lauren Kravitz, who's to my right, who each served as the Deputy Designated Federal Officer, and of course I'd already mentioned Jeff Goldthorpe. Now we are of course moving to recharter CSRIC for another 2-year term that begins this spring, since your charter expires on March 18th. The work of the next iteration of CSRIC will focus on 4 primary areas, which will be cybersecurity, next generation 911, next generation emergency alerting, and improvements to the priority communication services such as telecommunication system priority, wireless priority service, and the GETS program. So once again, on behalf of the chairman and our commissioners, thank you so much for your service and for being here today, and I look forward to the reports, Mr. Chairman.
Well, thank you. We'll get started with the first report. The co-chairs were Ed Amoroso of AT&T, who can't be with us. Gary Toretti is going to fill in for Ed, and Phil Agquilli with Cox Communications. So, gentlemen, if you're ready, we'll start with the first report, Report 2A.
Good morning, Chairman, Commissioners. My name is Gary Toretti. I'm with AT&T out of Dallas, Texas, and our group is the Cybersecurity Best Practices. Somebody running the slides? Bill?
There we go.
Great. Thank you. Our scope of our review was really to refresh the 2004 NRIC 7 cybersecurity best practices. Back in 2004, there were 187 cybersecurity best practices. As we looked at the cybersecurity best practices since 2004, a lot has changed within the industry itself from a telecom perspective. So we had divided the group into 9 subgroups, 5 vertical subgroups, which were the wireless, IP services, network, people, and legacy services, and 4 horizontal groups, which were identity management, encryption, vulnerability management, and incident response. The net result of 9 months of work was 397 cybersecurity best practices. So a lot more than the 187 back from 2004. Out of the 397, 41% are new cybersecurity best practices, 41% are modified from the NRIC 7 days, and 18% were the same. They remain the same. We're really looking at these best practices being scoped towards service providers, network operators, equipment suppliers, and we encourage everybody to review these cybersecurity best practices and implement them were applicable. Next slide. Our working group, as Bill had mentioned, had two co-chairs, Ed and Phil. We had members from across the industry, and you can see many of the industry is represented here within our working group itself. Let's go on to the next slide. What was the problem we were trying to resolve? Basically, since NRIC 7 occurred back in 2004, there's been a lot of change in the industry. With smartphones, with more wireless capability out there across the board, we have increasing attacks occurring against our infrastructures, against our devices that exist out there. We have cyber criminals, we have nation states seeking economic advantage. With botnets that are on our devices that are capturing keystrokes such as user IDs and passwords, we have these hackers that are working through advanced persistent threats, so they're a slow go type process of analyzing the environment and capturing information that exists out there. There is a large concern basically on making security better within this environment overall. Our primary objective was really to update the cybersecurity best practices to reflect the current technology environment that exists out there in the communication industry itself. Next slide. From a methodology standpoint, as I've already mentioned, we broke the group into 5 verticals. And as you can see, each of the groups were headed by an individual, and we asked the team to participate on at least 2 working groups across the board. We then asked the teams to go out and break down each of the functional areas into further topics overall. So case in point, take the wireless group. They broke that into Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, the mobile devices, mobile device application security, emerging devices, and really the 3G, 4G, microwave, and satellite areas underneath the wireless itself. So the groups worked very diligently over the 9-month process, many meetings through conference calls, face-to-face meetings that occurred. They looked at the NRIC 7 best practices. They also looked internally within their own company, their best practices, and across the industry from a best practices standpoint. Next slide. This is the horizontals, and what you have is the 4 horizontals, identity management, encryption, vulnerability, and incident response. I'm not going to go through these in detail. I know the print is very small. You probably can't see those, but it also breaks down each of these topics into subtopic areas overall. Next slide. So what were our findings? I'm not going to go through all 397 of the best practices. We may be here for the rest of the day. What I will do is just give you a synopsis under each of the 9 functional areas that exist out there. So from a wireless perspective, as we all know, there's been rapid changes within this environment overall. As we move from 3G to 4G, we now have home cell towers that exist out there with the femtocells. Smartphones are everywhere in the past 3-4 years. And really, we're moving to wireless everything. So as we looked at this area, we had 47 new best practices. We modified 3 existing best practices, and we left 2 of the NRIC 7 best practices unchanged. IP services, another hot area that's grown dramatically with high-speed broadband everywhere. It just seems like yesterday we were in dial-up mode, dial-up modems, and very slow speeds that existed across the board. Now everything is very high speed. Voice over IP has grown dramatically over the years, plus IPTV offerings. And then the latest and greatest, of course, is cloud computing, which really redefines our network and what perimeter security is all about. As we looked at this area, we had 21 new best practices. We modified 7 best practices, and we left 2 NRIC 7 best practices unchanged. Next slide. The network area, this was a high concentration of the NRIC 7 environment itself. And really, a lot of this is still valid today across the board. However, with the new devices that have come out, we had to go through and refresh a lot of the network best practices that existed out there. So we have 23 new best practices in this area. We modified 66 of the best practices, and we left 32 of the NRIC 7 best practices unchanged. From a people standpoint, social engineering, spam, data loss, data leakage, phishing, all continues to grow within the industry itself. Really wreaks havoc among the service providers, the network operators, and the government. We continue to work on security awareness across the industry, but it's had limited effectiveness so far, and we need to continue to build towards that. This particular area, we had 20 new best practices. We modified 9, and we left 7 unchanged. From a legacy standpoint, this area really was specific. You go to the next slide, please. Thank you. This area was specific to the SS7, network access control, authentication, denial of service protection, network design, and really the media gateways, CALIA, and the signal control points. As we look through these, there's been a lot of change also within this part of the industry, and they needed to be modernized. So as we went through this area, we came up with 23 new best practices. We modified 66 existing best practices, and we left 32 NRIC 7 best practices unchanged. Identity management, very critical area as we go forward within the industry itself, identifying people for the right access levels that they need within our systems across the board. As we move with cloud services, driving forward in the cloud environment, really in the federation that will occur from industry to industry, from a federation of identities, very critical for the industry as we drive forward. Here we had 8 new best practices, we modified 12, and we left 9 unchanged. Last 3 areas, encryption. Data at rest, data in transit across our data and cellular networks really requires us to protect the PII information that's out there. So strong key management is critical for validation and authentication. This area we had 8 new best practices, we modified 7, and we left 4 unchanged. Vulnerability management continues to be an extremely challenging area. With the zero-day vulnerabilities that are occurring within the industry today, extensive malware infections from websites, spam mail, general availability of botnet toolkits targeted at the entry-level hackers, this area continues to get a lot of need from a standpoint within the companies themselves. We found that we had 9 new best practices in this area. We modified 15, and we left 9 unchanged. Next slide. The last area being incident response, preparing for that potential business interruption. So as you have a security breach and making sure that you are prepared for dealing with the security breach, to quarantine the security breach and then eventually resolve and fix the underlying issues that exist out there, is critical to the success of the businesses. We found that 7 new best practices were created in this area. 35 were modified and 7 were left unchanged. And that's a quick synopsis of 397 best practices that we have across the board for cybersecurity. Our recommendation on the next slide is really for us to present these 397 best practices to the FCC in consideration of adopting the best practices for general use by the communication industry. This is an area that's going to continue to need to be focused on as we go forward, and as I just heard, I believe from Jeff or somebody down the table here, an area that will continue in the new CSRIC process that goes forward from here for the next 2 years. There are 3 areas, if you go to the next slide, that we would like the future consideration be given from a CSRIC perspective. One is the network provider, service provider network protection. There's been a lot of discussion lately around network providers, service providers providing the security for the home users that are infected and providing some way to take them off the internet itself. There's a lot of ad hoc processes that are in existence within the industry today. And I know Working Group 8 examined this area very carefully and came up with some recommendations. We feel strongly this is an area that needs to be continually looked at from a standpoint that we as an industry really need to work together to determine what are the best practices that can be implemented across the board, and then how do we measure the success rate of those best practices themselves. We can spend a lot of time and effort, but if we don't understand what the end result is and how well it's controlled the industry or how well it's cleaned the industry, then we haven't done our job. So this is an area that we'd like to see more time spent as we go forward with the next iteration of CSRIC. Border Gateway Protocols, BGP, really is the exchange of network reachability information between networks to allow the autonomous systems on the network to send messages efficiently to each other, interconnected networks. This is an area that we would recommend spending more time also because of the criticality of the industry, the criticality of the backbone network to all industry. Next slide. The last area for future consideration, of course, is there is more video on demand that's being downloaded today to various devices, whether they're handheld devices or laptop devices. And from a video or audio standpoint, we recommend the future councils look at this area a little bit more closely as it matures, as we drive forward for better controls around intellectual property. Our conclusions, we spent 9 months researching, analyzing, and evaluating cybersecurity best practices. As I stated earlier, our members spent a lot of time on conference calls, face-to-face meetings in various cities, countless hours of editing and revising our final report. We feel that this report is fair and accurate representation of our collective viewpoints and perspectives, and hope that this will improve cybersecurity through these best practices. Questions?
Thank you, Gary. I can't think of any area that is moving as rapidly as this, and I thank the group for the work that's been done here. I get a weekly report on the cyber attacks on our network worldwide, and it's staggering. The numbers are staggering, but the quality of, shall we say, high-impact attacks are what's really staggering to look at. So I think this work could not be more timely and more important to us. Any questions or comments for the committee? Yes.
John Morris, CDT. I've expressed some concerns to the working group about just one particular aspect of the report. I think the report is a very impressive and very useful report, and I certainly agree with many of its recommendations, particularly the recommendation that the CSRIC, the future CSRIC, continue to look at network security protection practices, which my working group 8 looked at. My concern about the report is really, I'll phrase it in terms of a suggestion for future CSRIC work, is that there is a little bit, there's a little loss of nuance between network security practices, cybersecurity practices that affect an internal network, how to protect your own network, and cybersecurity practices that might be applied to consumer-facing users. In other words, rules that you might adopt for your own internal corporate network, such as not having any open Wi-Fi access points is a very clear one that many corporations avoid open Wi-Fi access points for very strong reasons, are not necessarily rules that you would advise imposing on end users. That's a different kind of consideration. And so I'm concerned that there's a little bit of a lack of nuance. Obviously, the major service providers, the AT&Ts, the Comcast and all, very much appreciate the delicacy that one needs to address rules that you impose on your users. I have a concern that some smaller service providers may see some of the best practices, some of which, in the 2A working group recommend some best practices that actually the working group 8 specifically did not recommend for consumer-facing practices. So my suggestion really for a future CSRIC is to perhaps have a subgroup look particularly at cybersecurity practices and kind of evaluate, is this the kind of a practice that's appropriate to think about for a consumer-facing rule or a consumer-facing guideline versus an internal network practice? Because I think there are some rules that are very appropriate for service providers' own networks that may not be appropriate. So just really a going forward suggestion. Again, I do think that the report is an excellent report, and just wanted to express that concern and urge that future work.
Thank you. I will take this opportunity to kind of make a comment on something that's very important to me and has been on every NRIC and now CSRIC committee I've sat on, is the fact that best practices themselves are by definition not necessarily applicable in every case. And I think it's very important that we all remember that, because if we start developing these reports in a context that what we're writing is always the best thing to do, I think it really changes the nature. And I won't bore the committee with examples, but there were many examples going back to even post-Katrina situations where we found that what you typically do to protect a network may not apply in a low-lying area, and you have different rules there. So I think the comment's right, and I just urge the committee to, or anyone that reads the best practice, to remember that I think they're written in the context of generally would apply in most cases, but not each and every case. So, any other questions for the committee? If not, do I have a motion to vote? Second? All in favor? Aye. Opposed? Congratulations, your report's approved. Thank you very much for all your work. We'll move on to Working Group 2B now, MSRC Best Practice Update. We will have Bob Ross from CBS, who chaired the group, and Charlie Fagan, also from CBS, presenting. Gentlemen? Down in the corner.
Yep, there we go. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here this morning after 2 years of hard work by a lot of people. We can have the first slide, then we'll keep this brief. Our challenge was to update the MSRC work, and we have completed that work. And I want to thank everybody who worked on it. It's 4 rather large documents that we updated. Each more than 50 pages. I don't think I'll read them this morning, just the same reason they didn't do theirs either. But each document is kind of centered around radio, television, direct-to-home, and cable type services. During MSRC 1, a number of best practices were developed, and then between MSRC 1 and 2, those were disseminated. We realized that the practices were written at too high a level, 50,000-foot level, as we say it. And they did not translate to the very actionable items by the local chief engineer and operating locations at a small 500-watt radio station somewhere, for example. So in MSRC 2, the toolkit group, which I was co-chair of, turned those into a pretty massive document on how to do a lot of this stuff. And the other part was a checklist of things that you need to think about if you're going to harden your facility to any kind of an outage. So next slide, please. This is an example of some of the questions. There's better than 50 of them in each of the documents, customized for the 4 documents. And, you know, simple questions, but they weren't necessarily translated well to, you know, a small TV or radio station. You know, does the disaster recovery plan identify the essential personnel necessary to carry out the restoration efforts? Yes, no. Obviously, if you check off enough no's, you really need to think about how well prepared your facility is. And they are in the document, so I won't go through any more of those. That's the typical kind of questions they asked. Next slide, please. We did receive some comments back after the documents were circulated. First off, the second I sent them off to everybody, Charlie raised his hand and said, I found another spelling error. And this is after having been reviewed. You know how many times we reviewed them all. So we've updated those with straight just spelling and other formatting changes to make the documents look the best they can. We changed several words from mandatory and required to encouraged or recommended because they were done in all the documents, because of course this is kind of recommended best practices and may or may not be required for any particular location. An example would be the disaster recovery plan, you know, should be reviewed annually, but it may not need to be, all of it may not to be needed to be reviewed annually. So they were relatively small changes. We also received a comment, next slide please. In the cable document there was some questions about no direct mention of the two-way services, both internet and phone services that cable providers are providing. Since the first document, and we were updating it to the second document, is in fact on how to restore the service or services, and we didn't make any distinction of what those services were, we elected not to try to open the document back up and make all the changes necessary to conform it for the restoration of both internet services and you know, phone services that are provided by the cable companies. And lastly, the documents are not necessarily for the large group or chief engineer of a group of television or radio stations. They really are written to be looked at by the local operating people, just to see what they are, because the senior management in all of these companies don't really know exactly how each of their entities work, because they are scattered, you know, all over the United States. They should be widely circulated to those industries and used as templates as part of their own disaster recovery scenarios. Not one person or group of people in an organization can think up all the things, and if they read through it, as always you go, oh, I hadn't thought about that in a while. And at a minimum, the vulnerability checklists should be reviewed, again, at the local level for the various entities, and some of them do cross over. The direct-to-home would include radio direct-to-home or other such organizations, but just to flip through them and to find out what changes need to be made. So that's it for my report. I just want to thank on my staff Charlie Fagan, who helped organize all the documents and keeping the many revisions straight, and that's it. So comments, questions?
Questions for the committee? Yes, John.
Well, I'm going to be a little bit of a skunk in the garden party today, but just with a few comments. And I've discussed my concerns with Bob, and his group did look at the concerns, and I think the report is, again, a very useful and helpful document. As a suggestion for future work, and the MSRC process from the old INRIC really was focused primarily on broadcasting emergency information to the public, really a one-way communication. And so the disaster recovery plan for cable doesn't really do anything, doesn't really kind of think through the extra steps that one might need to take to ensure that two-way communications are restored, since now obviously internet communications are very much a part, consumer-based internet communications are very much a part of kind of how the public gets information about disasters. I would just suggest that to the extent that the future CSRICs look at disaster recovery plans again, that it pay particular attention to whether extra steps need to be done to restore two-way communications. And Bob and I have discussed that, and I think it's a very good report and look forward to supporting it.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions or comments? Yes.
Is that on? Yeah, thanks.
Yes.
I absolutely agree, but I also want to underscore the importance of making sure that the broadcast facilities and that one-way push-out are not underestimated. And I congratulate you, Bob, on a good report. The MSRIC 1 and 2 recommendations have been broadly implemented by stations, and I know, for example, one of our stations, Vegas PBS, who built out new facilities about 2 years ago, year and a half ago, their new facilities are completely MSRIC compliant. So stations have taken to heart those recommendations, and they will with the update. And while I don't disagree with your comment about two-way, I do think it's important, particularly when we see times of disaster, et cetera, how the broadcast facilities still have to get information out to the public. So these are important recommendations, and they're taken to heart.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments? Do I have a motion that we approve the report? Second? All in favor? Opposed? Congratulations. Thanks again for a wonderful work product.
Thank you, everyone.
Now I'd like to introduce Working Group 4B, the transition to Next Generation 911. The co-chairs and the presenters for that work group are Brian Fonts from NENA, the National Emergency Number Association, and Lori Flaherty from the U.S. Department of Transportation.
Okay, we're going to tag team this presentation. So moving right along to slide number 2. This slide contains the charge of 4B, which was building on the work of 4A to determine what changes, additions need to be made to 911 related standards and best practices for the evolution of the next generation of 911. We were to consider 4 broad topics within that realm: the technical issues, the operational challenges, the funding challenges, and the ways that 911 technologies can improve access for people with disabilities and non-English speaking communities. We were to evaluate and recommend how changes could be accomplished, what groups could perform the work, and an appropriate schedule for those actions. Sort of a broad charge with regard to depth and breadth. Next slide, please. We had 53 members as part of this group. Brian and I were the co-chairs, and we divided into 4 subgroups, those addressing the major topic areas of this group, those being technology, operations, funding, and access. Each of those 4 subgroups met independently on an ongoing basis to complete their work. However, there were monthly conference calls to coordinate the efforts of all of those groups and make sure that the group was consistent in terms of the work that was accomplished. The consensus process was observed, and the content was developed, reviewed, and the report was developed.
Then within the 4 subgroups, Jeff, I don't know if this is on or not. Within the 4 subgroups, the first one was the technology subgroup, and they dealt with the following issues: the technical standards, service and access provider related issues, coordination and control of next generation 911 implementation, and existing 911 best practices. The operational subgroup dealt with the PSAP operational issues. If we could have the next slide. And you'll see a number of the issues that the PSAP operational issues identified. And then also the systems operational issues, and there's a series of those as well. The funding subgroup looked at a number of issues related to funding, primarily the eroding revenues of long-established funding methods, the inequity in collection across service types, the shifting of shifting of use of communication technologies, collection challenges, and so forth, with probably the last one being the most important one, and that is the diversion of funds for non-911 purposes. The Access subgroup dealt with a number of issues, and they've examined 23 methods that are currently being used by people with disabilities to access 911. And they're also identified a number of non-English speaking community issues associated with accessing 911, and they're also located in this slide as well.
Okay, moving on to the analysis and findings. The work group used a variety of methods in order to discuss, analyze, and come to conclusions and recommendations. They analyzed best practices, examples, and models. In some cases, a gap analysis was utilized to identify issue areas requiring new actions. Several subgroups also conducted an assessment of current and proposed standards as part of their analysis. And what you see in these subsequent slides in terms of recommendations is not meant to be an exhaustive list of recommendations, but rather a representation of the recommendations that the group came to. So moving right along, I'm not going to read through all of these, but I will highlight a couple as we move forward. That second bullet is one of the ones that was highlighted: to accelerate research and development into emerging technologies for people with disabilities to access 911. And those may include near-term technologies like TTY emulation and longer-term, as well as longer-term evaluation, research, and development of real-time text standards. Another recommendation of the group was that the FCC should engage as appropriate to support the introduction of legislation to address the liability protection issues related to the use of SMS in accessing 911, as well as support national efforts to provide appropriate public education in this area, because that is felt to be very important. In terms of the operational recommendations, next slide, please. A couple just to highlight. Developing models of consortium arrangements and governance supporting system operations, roles and responsibilities. Regional and state level coordination should be identified and implemented moving forward. And then that second last bullet reads, the FCC should work with appropriate federal agencies and non-governmental organizations such as NARUC and NCSL to evaluate regulations, legislation, and tariffs to identify and make recommendations on needed modifications. Moving on to funding recommendations, the technical standards do weigh in heavily in terms of funding because adherence to adopted standards becomes important to ensure interoperability and to minimize the cost of implementation. Also, one recommendation that you did see repeatedly in this document was the formation of a blue ribbon panel to address 911 funding issues in general and make recommendations for funding for the construction and maintenance of NG 911 systems. In terms of access, again, a couple of recommendations to highlight. The work that is currently underway for Novus industry standards should be encouraged and accelerated. Technical standards leaders in this area should reach out to the accessibility community so that all parties are in agreement with regard to what is being done. And any kind of guidance or assistance or coordination on the part of FCC in this regard would be extremely useful. Also, the second last bullet with regard to access on this page reads that the FCC should work with other federal agencies to consider how best to certify devices and services, excuse me, or develop other processes to ensure that the devices and services can properly provide emergency access when needed. So, moving on to conclusions, there were several recurrent themes, issues, conclusions, and recommendations that came forward from multiple subgroups. And just to highlight a couple of those, clear rules, strategy, and policy with regard to how the transition will be accomplished is very important. Harmonized NG 911 standards also become extremely important in the implementation of NG 911. The use of SMS to contact 911 is a contentious issue. Currently, some legislative and regulatory environments don't adequately enable non-voice services, and this is obviously an area that will need some future attention. As was mentioned in the previous recommendations, existing legislation, regulations, and liability issues must be addressed. A blue ribbon panel was recommended to address 911 funding issues in general, and any acceleration of efforts to provide equal access to all people contacting emergency services is highly recommended as well.
Great. What we'd like to do is to pick up, once the report was circulated among the committee members here, we received a few requests for comments or edits to be included in the report. The first comment really addressed the issue of taking a look at Next Generation 911 and comporting the standards that we will be developing here in the United States on the international front as well. And there was a substantial amount of language that was proposed, and specifically there was an effort to propose a conclusion related to the international part of it. In vetting that with the working group, they felt that it wasn't fully discussed to the extent of recommending a specific conclusion. But what we did recommend, and there was consensus on, was to include language that you see presented there, beginning with because, and the slide, to include that in the section 4.1.2, where we talk about some of the international issues, so as to underscore the fact that once we do develop our standards here, there is some coordination and development with these standards that are evolving internationally. So that was the first comment, if you will, that was presented to the report as it was circulated, and that is how we address that comment in our deliberations. The second comments, and this was a little more substantial in nature, and I certainly want to express my appreciation to Bob and Liz and Jeff and other folks, as well as 4B, for discussing these issues. The edits that were recommended, or changes that some of the members of our panel asked us to address, were found on pages 5, 12, 43, 45, 92, 95, and 135, just a few. And so most of these focused on the issues of funding. Now, some of these issues were funding in the course of the discussion within the findings of the working group, and some of these were recommendations that were made by the working group. And so as a result of deliberation over the last week, and again, I appreciate everybody's time and energy put into this, the edits to page 5, 12, and 43, those areas of funding, which in large part go to the beginning of the document talking about the report, and then generally talking about the funding issues, include the language, and consensus and agreement was reached to include the language that's presented on this slide, which basically is asking for a blue ribbon panel to be created to address a lot of the funding issues related to the construction and maintenance of the Next Generation 911 system. There was no disagreement on inclusion of that edit, that paragraph, if you will, to the sections on pages 5, 12, and 43. So that's how that was addressed and taken care of. Also, you'll find that there were recommended changes on page 135, and again, is that the correct slide up there? Yes. And again, there was no disagreement, and this section dealt with recommendations to the report. So there was no disagreement on inserting this language in here as well, relating to the need for the creation of a blue ribbon panel to look at funding for Next Generation 911. So that's how that particular issue was addressed with respect to the recommendations section of the report. Next, there were two sections. Yeah, there are two sections. I'm going to ask Laurie to circulate some documents here that were really part of the findings of the report and not the conclusions. And the findings were really the points that were discussed within the working group. And there were some specific recommendations that were made to those 2 pages. And if I think the next slide will address those changes. Yeah, they're very hard to read on the slide, particularly if you don't have the right glasses on. So this document that's going around will help you understand what the proposed edits were and what was either agreed to or not agreed to. On page 92, for those who do have your report in front of you, it was recommended that the last sentence in paragraph 1, reading a funding mechanism for those newly acquired functions will...
Brian, I'm sorry, maybe you should hold off till we get the paper.
Oh, I'm
around
sorry.
here.
Yep, we'll wait a second. There's 2 sections going around, one dealing with page 92, the other one dealing with page 95. It's basically what's on the screen, but it just will allow you to read it more clearly. Yeah, one's going one way and the other one's going the other way, so everybody should just take one page as it comes by in the stack. I was debating whether to staple them all last night.
Does everybody have one now? Yes. Oh. Oh, it's coming the other way.
Yeah.
We have them.
That's right.
Yeah,
They were
we're going-
circulated in 2 different directions, so
I
it's-
see, okay. So it's not sufficient that the railroad from the east and the railroad and the west
right.
meet in Ogden, they have to pass and go keep going,
That's right. Promontory Point is over there somewhere.
Okay. No, that is, you got the same thing twice.
Okay, so on the top of each page, under the section number, we'll reference page 92 or 95 to make it easier to follow. Okay. Now, I was debating last night whether I should staple these pages together, and in hindsight, I probably should have.
Yeah, I think the first page may be all the way around. The first page is the one that says
Great. The first page should be page 92.
Does everybody have 92? No, we're waiting. We're still waiting over here for 92.
I think there's some 92 needed at this end of the table on this side. No problem.
I think we're okay now.
Okay, thank you. I apologize for the confusion and circulating them in 2 different directions. Thought it would be helpful. On page 92, this is the first edit that was made to the document, and then that edit was brought back to the working group, and consensus could not be reached. Now, the context for this edit is the discussions that took place within 4B. They're not the recommendations of 4B. So What was originally presented is this page without any of the lines drawn through it, and with the exception of what is highlighted in terms of the blue ribbon panel. So toward the end of last week, it was recommended that the last sentence in the first paragraph, a funding mechanism for these newly acquired functions will need to be established, that be deleted, as well as the next full paragraph, and then inserting the paragraph reading, the reader should note blah, 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 relating to the blue ribbon panel. Now, what the working group agreed to was the insertion of the section dealing with the blue ribbon panel, but could not accept the edits to delete the last sentence and that paragraph beginning according to. And the reason the working group felt that it could not delete that sentence and that paragraph was because that went to the discussion that took place within working group 4B. So that's page 92. Page 95, does everybody have that as well? Okay, there's a couple of folks here that do not have page 95, some on this side. We'll wait a second.
Yeah, it says 95 at the top.
Yeah, it's
In blue.
right at the top of the page. There's a section there that says 95, page 95.
I think everybody has it now.
Okay, everybody there? Page 95 is in essence the same thing as page 92 with respect to the discussion and the findings part of what 4B talked about. But again, it is not the recommendations that 4B came up with. So on page 95, you see that it was recommended on the first paragraph that the last sentence be deleted. The second paragraph, that one paragraph that represents one sentence should be deleted, and everybody agreed to the insertion of the blue ribbon panel language found in the last paragraph. So there was much discussion, believe me, much discussion and debate associated with the recommended edits to those two sections of the report. In total, there were 5 sections that were addressed by members of this group. 3 of those sections, the edits were included. These 2 sections, the edits that were included related to the blue ribbon panel for funding, but the recommended edits on pages 92 and 95 were not accepted by, I guess there was no consensus, put it that way, in the 4B group and the subgroup on funding, simply because it addressed, and there were some of the representatives in that group felt that those 2 sections, page 92 and 95, represented, in essence, a part of the discussion that took place. And they felt that removing that would, in fact, remove part of the discussion of working group 4B funding. So, in a nutshell, those are the 5 recommendations, 3 of which were accepted. Most importantly, the recommendation includes the recommendation of a blue ribbon panel. And 2, we could not reach consensus on page 95 and 92 with respect to removing those, the recommended edits.
So Brian, can I just clarify then, what is being voted is the text that is in, I suppose, peach color on my copies. That would be what you're actually proposing to vote on today.
Right, the text would, correct me if I'm wrong.
It's important to note that the significant portions of the working group did not come to consensus on the deletion of those portions that have been struck. So there are two issues. One is the insertion of the new language, and the second is the deletion of the sections that with the line through it.
To answer your question is yes, everybody's agreed to, or there's consensus upon including the peach-colored highlighted area.
So what your committee has voted out and is putting forth for vote for the larger group today is the language that's in the peach color here.
The language in the peach color
Grant-
and the
and-
text
and-
would remain the same.
And I'm
Right.
hearing that there was some dissenting points of view within the subcommittee about that, but I'm just trying to get clarity around what's being proposed for vote today.
That is correct.
Well, Brian, now I'm confused. Is the language, for example, on page 92, the last sentence of the first paragraph and the second paragraph that are lined out on this document, that deletion was not accepted. So therefore, that language and the peach language
Remains
is in
intact.
the report to be voted upon.
Correct.
Oh, that's,
Okay, that's what,
typically when you look at edited material, when it's struck through, that means it's not there. So.
Well, that's what we wanted to be perfectly clear about.
And
What you saw struck through was the recommended edits that were not agreed to by the working group within, the subgroup within 4B. What was agreed to was the peach language. So if you were to read this in terms of what was presented in the findings section of this report, it would be the language that appears to be struck out would actually be included, and including the peach highlighted blue ribbon panel language for pages 92 and 95. The other three sections, the edits were in fact incorporated as recommended by a subgroup of the folks in CSRIC.
And I guess technically, as I look at the charter for this group, it says that you should consider technical as well as operational and funding challenges. I don't think the charter asks the group to propose a funding mechanism.
It's not a recommendation, it's not a proposal. What you're looking at are part of the proceedings of the working group. It is in fact a statement of the record of what was discussed. And when we brought the deletion, if you will, to the working group, the objection was to the fact that what was a relevant portion, or what was felt to be a relevant portion of the discussion was deleted. There are two topics that, the two topics on page 92 and 95 were discussed at length and multiple times within the group. And the objection was to the deletion of them in the findings section of the report. No one is trying to say that any recommendations should be made on either one of these. That there's clearly, there's clearly an agreement with the group with regard to that. What there is a disagreement about is the deletion of what in fact are the proceedings of the working group.
is there any?
Go ahead, Bob.
No, I was just saying, is there anything else from the co-chairs before we open it to the floor for discussion? No, okay. I'd like to open this issue up for discussion or questions. Yes, sir.
Yeah, and
Please identify yourselves for people who can't see your name tag too. Thank you.
sure it's Maurice Tozay, Telecommunication Systems. Not to belabor it and not to muddy it, and I know the issue I'm going to speak to is to be addressed at the next CSRIC, but of great import and need for some immediate attention so that next gen can roll out with best speed, due speed in this era of convergence, or this of a connected world in many facets, is and maybe because it's not under this charter with funding, we brought it up late in the game, I guess, but as a need to address protection, especially now as next gen will be rolled out more by PSAP, small communities. There needs to be a cohesive approach to IP litigation with convergence and all that portends and the greatness of what we can do with next gen if there's not IP litigation protection. It's another funding mechanism that goes beyond transition and maintenance, et cetera, because small PSAPs or state jurisdictions that now will be sued instead of the carriers and providers to the carriers can delay or impede what is intended to be a great service to the people of the United States. This is a public service and one that is expected to in fact operate. I mean, there are remedies, but there needs to be clarity, in fact, around 28 U.S. 1498, which says there's patent protection if the entity is providing a service for the United States. So just a comment, not asking for anything to be done here, but it really needs to be addressed in the next CSRIC.
Thank you. Joe.
Jim Corey from the Satellite Industry Association. Unfortunately, I don't have a copy of your final report in front of me. Left it at the office last night. What I want to understand is, if I were looking at page 92 and 95 in your final report, would I see all of this language without underlines, without strike-throughs, and without peach coloring?
You're asking me, the answer is yes.
That clarifies it for me. Thank you.
Yes, sir. Art?
My sense in what I'm hearing here is that the co-chairs, Brian and Laurie, would if they had their druthers, leave in the stuff that is struck. Is that true?
Yes, that is true.
And the way it's worded is, it's an example. It's not a specific proposal. It gets to be more of a specific proposal on the second section, page 95, but that says if a national fee. Now, one could either say leave that in, or one could say you take the peach-colored part, and that would be one of the proposals that would be considered by the Blue Ribbon panel. Is that correct?
The Blue Ribbon panel could look at this or any other. We're not directing specifically the Blue Ribbon panel. Based on the evolution of discussion in this process relating to funding, there were arguments that were made by the public safety groups, and there were arguments made by others. And the arguments and the net of all of this recognizes that there's a number of issues related to funding that go beyond this report. And the only way to accommodate everyone's best interest, although it was raised in the discussion part of the working group, was to make the recommendation that this Blue Ribbon panel be created to address a variety of funding issues. So that's how the funding issue, although raised and discussed, was ultimately resolved in terms of a recommendation that would be presented as part of the CSRIC report to the Commission.
Given the nightmares that the industry has lived through relative to funding over the last 16 years, I'd like to see the specifics. I kind of like the stuff that was struck.
Let's be perfectly clear what's presented here. And I'm sorry for this confusion, but I was trying to reflect the edits that were recommended. But what is recommended on these 2 pages that go to the discussion, not the recommendation, right. I keep underscoring that, is the fact that there were recommended edits here that are represented by the crossouts or the strike-throughs, but there was no consensus reached within the group to accept those recommended edits. And so we recognize full well, and hence the recommendation, and it took a lot to get to the point of the recommendation itself that a Blue Ribbon panel should address the issue of funding. It's very complicated in 8 months or 9 months to try to address all aspects of funding related to Next Generation 911, both from the PSAP side and then from any entity, be it state, federal, local government, or anyone else that's going to be contributing to the funds. It becomes extraordinarily complicated, and frankly, this report could not do justice to the multitude of issues related to that. And thus, we all agreed to the need to create this blue ribbon panel to address the funding issue. Does that answer your question, Art?
I think so, yeah. It seems to me then, are we looking at basically a bifurcated vote, where we either vote this up or down and then vote to accept the report as currently written?
I'd leave that up to the chairs and how they want to do that.
I believe what we're voting on is the report as, with the only changes are the changes the work group has agreed to. So it would be the report, including the deleted language in this particular section.
In those two sections.
Plus the reference to the blue ribbon panel here.
And
more importantly, I think, in the recommendation section, the only thing, and this is in your report at this point, the only thing that's there is the blue ribbon panel recommendation. The discussion about various fee mechanisms does not appear in the recommendations as to be voted upon, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. Yes, sir.
Thanks, Bob. And so on behalf of CTIA, let me thank the chairs of the 4B, Brian and Lori, for your hard work on this report, and also for your efforts to engage with us on these issues. We certainly appreciate there are many, many helpful suggestions in the report about how to ensure that consumers have access to next-gen 911, and the wireless industry is fully committed to that effort. Let me note also, certainly you can see the funding issues in this report continue to be among the most challenging, I think, in the NG 911 debate. And I do want to just make clear for everyone, at every opportunity that was afforded the full 4B working group, and then at CSRIC, CTIA and its member companies have noted concerns about the findings and analysis and recommendations on funding. This is an issue of importance to all service providers, but I think certainly particularly for wireless carriers, which alone collect over $2 billion each year in dedicated taxes, fees, and surcharges for the purpose of supporting and upgrading E911 capabilities. So we certainly recognize that that the money that's collected in good faith from wireless consumers has been and will continue to be extremely critical in supporting public safety. I think our concern here stems from the potential impact that additional fees layered on can have on wireless consumer bills. It's certainly amplified by concerns about fund diversion, which are teed up in the report. So, as I'm sure you've seen from the edits that we've been discussing, we continue to have concerns about suggestions for new or additional taxes, fees, surcharges, and I want to kind of really highlight quickly 3 of those concerns, which are that consumers, and I think particularly wireless consumers, often face duplicative 911 fees imposed by states, counties, and local authorities on the same 911 service. Second, taxes and fees collected from wireless consumers under the auspices of 911 deployment have been, and I think the report does a nice job recognizing this, diverted for other revenue priorities. And that diversion was approximately $100 million in 2009. And then finally, I think we would note that we're concerned about the high level of taxation on wireless generally. Wireless consumers are subject to 16% in taxes and fees as compared to other taxable goods, which are at a level more like 7%. I guess with that said, let me say, we think that the final 4B report doesn't capture those concerns to the extent that we would like, but we do support the consensus proposal that Brian and Lori and CTI's member companies have arrived at, which is to develop a blue ribbon panel to study 911 funding as a whole. We certainly believe that a blue ribbon panel can play a useful role in addressing these issues going forward. We also appreciate the effort to include language that reminds future readers of this report that there remain disagreements and there remains work to be done. I guess with that said, we look forward to those continuing discussions. We appreciate you all noting our concern here today. We are prepared to accept the work of the working group and to move forward, but we certainly appreciate and thank you your willingness to engage on these issues.
Thank you. I know there's some people on the phone, and unfortunately, they do not have the benefit of the paper that was distributed. Does anyone on the phone request a further explanation or reading of the actual document? Are people still on the phone?
Yes, we are.
Yes. Yep.
Okay, would you like us to read the language discussion that we've been talking about?
Would be helpful.
Okay. I think if you read,
have access to the slides?
I don't know if they do or not.
You do have access to the slides? No, you don't have access to the slides.
Perhaps
Okay.
if Brian,
Good.
if you would, maybe the shorter one, which captures this, perhaps the better, I'm thinking, it's up to you, but to take page 95 and just read it exactly
Yep.
as it appears.
All you need is just read each language and tell them where to go.
Exactly.
Oh, that's true. 'Cause
Exactly.
The
Thank
language
you,
that
Bill.
you're not deleting is in the report that was submitted to them.
Right.
So the only
So-
new language is the,
So if you go to page 95 of the report, and it's section 5.3.2.3.5.1, did you get all of that? The only language that would be inserted in that section would be a last paragraph that would go as follows. The reader should note that while several concepts on Next Generation 911 funding were discussed in the CSRIC 4B working group, there was a lack of consensus on specific recommendations. Consensus was reached on the recommendation that the FCC should encourage the National 911 program to convene a blue ribbon panel as soon as possible to address 911 funding issues and make recommendations for funding the construction and maintenance of Next Generation 911 systems. That's the inserted language that would be on page 92 and 95. And no deletions.
is there any further discussion either here in the room or from those on the telephone? Hearing, yes, sir.
I have a comment.
Yes, sir.
I'm sitting here representing rural telecommunication carriers, and unfortunately, since 1994, they've been disproportionately impacted by the funding mechanisms that have been put in place. If you look at some states, you get so much funding per customer, and yet you get an incredible cost that you have to put in the network for the past types of 911 location. So wherever we go with this, whether a blue ribbon panel or whatever, I think it has to take into account the small carrier and their lack of customer base that can afford to put in whatever it has to be done, will put in. I lived through it as a CTO of small carriers, and it was a tough, tough nut to crack. Thank you.
Hey, John.
Hey, Brian. So two quick comments. One is I'm thrilled that I am not the biggest pain in the neck for this particular working group. I'm afraid I may have been that for some of the other working groups. And I just want, I was the one who made the comment that Brian and Lori responded to about the international standards and the need for international standards. And I simply just want to highlight that that I know that Nina and the emergency community is very, very well aware of the more interconnectedness that the Next Generation 911 system will need to be relative to the kind of the existing American 911 system. But I just think it's a very important point for the FCC to really appreciate that in the new Next Generation 911 system, it really will need to rely on international standards that the U.S. will have to be cooperating. And so I appreciate your group's willingness to accommodate that concern in the report.
Thank you, John.
Any other discussion? Before I ask for a motion, I just want to add my thanks to Lori and Brian and for those in the carrier industry and others who had raised issues. There was a lot of work to try to reach some degree of consensus on this, and I know there were a lot of phone calls, and we appreciate the effort. On that, I will entertain a motion.
So moved.
Second? Yeah, I'm sorry. Were you making a motion or give further? Okay.
Yes, Bob, I recommend, I'm William Brownlow of the National Public Safety Telecommunications Council. I recommend that the report be accepted as written with the addition of the paragraph stating that the group could not come to a consensus on the exact wording, but leave in the discussion about the different funding mechanisms because that was part of a discussion. It is not part of a recommendation.
And that's consistent with what we've just been discussing, correct? Okay.
That is correct.
All right, so that's the motion on the table. And do we have a second? Seconded. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Nays? With that, the motion passes. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Now we move on to 4C, the technical options for E911 location accuracy. The co-chairs of that were Steve Wisely from APCO, the Association of Public Safety Communications Officials, and Craig Frost from Verizon Wireless. They will be presenting along with Kathy McMahon, who is also with APCO.
And on behalf of all the members of the 4C working group who demonstrated extreme professionalism and subject matter expertise throughout the multiple meetings that we had, I want to thank you for the opportunity to begin presenting our final summary of the report on technical options for E911 location accuracy. We are going to split this up a little bit. I will cover the background and the framework. Kathy will talk about some additional topics that surfaced during our meetings, and Steve will close with recommendations and conclusions. We did receive comments from John Morris. Steve will cover those, and I believe John has some comments to make at the conclusion. He's a popular guy today. To recap on the charter, we were asked to examine location technologies that are in use today, identify the performance and limitations of those for use in the next-gen 911 public safety applications, and then to evaluate standards direction, emerging location technologies, the timing of such technologies, security issues, interactions with existing technologies, the opportunities to apply next-generation location technologies to current networks, and the impacts of user equipment and various network elements, as well as agencies, and then the barriers to deploying those technologies. Next slide. During the discussions that we had, the group also found that there were three basic principles that were guiding our discussions. The first was that we're dealing with a transition from wireline to mobile wireless telephony. A significant increase in the percentage of E911 calls are being made via mobile telephony, and a larger percentage of calls are being made in environments that have challenges from a location accuracy perspective. Second was that services that were initially targeted for static or nomadic usage have now become mobile or are being used differently than were originally intended. If you think about over-the-top VoIP applications on a wireless handset, would be one example there. There was discussion about that a possible solution could be to deploy automatic location methods. However, that's not a straightforward or simple process and will require the support of a very large and complicated ecosystem to deliver that kind of location update. And then finally, it was clear that in speaking with the public safety community, as well as what the carriers are hearing, is that the public expectation is that any service can contact 911 and the location will be known and provided regardless of service type. As we've mentioned before, the working group broke down into a couple of subgroups. The first one we allocated to identifying the service types and applications that required 911 location information. You can see the range from your plain old telephone service all the way down through commercial mobile radio service, over the top voice over broadband, and PBX and MLTS and the challenges that they bring in. In the report, each one of these service types is identified with the current location determination method, any gaps, and other comments about the service types. Continuing on the service types, we also have new network elements that require location information, such as femtocells. We know that there is a movement towards telematics and increased machine-to-machine. We have our telecommunication relay service, call centers, satellite service, and as has been mentioned before, and I'm sure is on the top of everyone's mind, non-voice centric emergency services in the next-gen 911 environment. The second key subgroup we had focused in on location technologies, the first group being those that are currently deployed. We have the familiar GPS or the AGPS in the wireless domain, also uplink time differential of arrival, RF pattern matching, downlink time difference of arrival, cell ID, and enhanced cell ID. In terms of the emerging location technologies that were reviewed, most of the options are some kind of a beacon-based technology, be that Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, proprietary pilot beacons, etc. We also looked at an option that was available, we thought at the beginning of the work group's effort, which was the use of DTV transmitters. However, that group appears to no longer be pursuing that, but we wanted to include it for completeness in the report. And then there's discussion as well about hybrid location combinations, so taking one or more, or two or more of the options and combining them together for improved accuracy. As we discussed the broad nature of the charter, there were a few other items that came up that are crucial to the accuracy of the location, for the acquisition of location, the delivery of location, and for the use of location. And Kathy McMahon from APCO will cover the next few items.
Yeah, there were several things that came into play when we talk about location accuracy. And I think probably everyone in the room, when you talk about wireless 911 location accuracy, you think of the location coming from the cell phone. And that absolutely is critical. But at the 911 center end, at the PSAP end, you could be getting a great location coming in from the wireless carrier, but if you don't have a great map to plot it on, we're still not going to be moving in the direction we need to move in. And in order to have a great map to plot it on, the databases that control those maps, which are called GIS, Graphical Information Systems, they've got to really be on target. And as we move forward to next-gen 911, those GIS databases are beginning to become more and more and more critical. And they've got to be synced with other databases that are referenced in the report, the Master Street Address Guide databases that tell you how you have to format an address in today's world. And the effort that it's going to take for all of the 911 centers and the addressing authorities and the 911 authorities at a national level to get those databases really where they need to be is significant. And it's not without significant cost. So wireless location accuracy really is a double-edged sword. And I don't want to, I'm not letting any of the wireless carriers off the hook, but there's a lot of work that needs to be done with consistency and standardization of how these GIS data sets are going to be managed going forward, especially as we continue to rely on them more and more and more for next generation 911, because that's how we'll route the calls. I don't know what happened to our slide. Another topic that we needed to cover was the security issues with regard to location accuracy, and I think the security working group with the 397 best practices they're coming out with probably have covered those pretty well. Security with regard to specific location accuracy technologies, I believe in the report, we're recommending that that continue to be looked at. A lot of issues are still evolving, and as you move into an IP world, it continues to grow and migrate. So as the security working group recommended, that's something that really needs to continue to be looked at and analyzed, you know, as we move forward. One of the issues with security and location, some of you may have heard of spoofing. Anytime you're relying on your 911 location being provided by a customer, you run the risk that that customer is either accidentally providing an incorrect location or that that customer could intentionally be providing a wrong location. So if I take my my mobile device somewhere when I'm on vacation, or I move it, and I have to physically register the address that device is going to be at, if I want to intentionally, make a 911 call and have the police show up at my neighbor's house that way, that's an issue. And that's an issue that will continue to need to be addressed whenever we're relying on customers providing the location that's going to be used for 911. Standards Development Organization. There are a number of national and international standards development organizations that are currently engaged in or have been engaged in drafting technical standards that could, will, and should impact 911 location accuracy. And I think everybody's familiar with the concept that the more people you have at the party, the less apt you are to miss that the convergence of standards coming into play may not always be in sync. So the technical standards that come into play for location accuracy and whether or not they are all in sync with one another is something that really needs to stay on the radar for everyone involved. Empirical data studies, that's important. It's important for the 911 centers, the 911 authorities, the wireless carriers, everyone involved to engage empirical studies to see how we're doing. The Project Red report that came out of the state of California, a new version of that's just been made available. We had a couple representatives that were able to speak to that, and it's included in our report. It was a significant effort. And we learned a lot in the discussions on empirical studies of being sure that from a technical subject matter expertise, you really understand just what it is you're studying and what those results are telling you. And from just a pure public safety, non-technical perspective, what I think the data might be telling me may, from a technical perspective, not be quite in sync. So it's important that everybody involved in wireless location accuracy be involved and come to the table when empirical studies are engaged, so you know what you're doing, how you're doing it, and what it's really telling you. I believe it's your turn. Next slide.
Thank you, Kathy. The 30-plus members of Work Group 4C arrived at, through consensus, about 20 conclusions and probably 40 recommendations, which we won't go over all those this morning. We did receive, as Craig acknowledged, some proposals from John Morris, who will speak to it, that would modify or delete a number of the recommendations that did not pass the consensus of 4C. So the report that you see today is the complete report with a few minor wordings that were inserted into the dialogue early on, and that's been submitted to Jeff, and they're very minor. But just let me go over a number of the highlights of the conclusions that would be on the screen. And number one would be the FCC established the Technical Advisory Group, or the ETAG. This has been talked about for some amount of time. You will note as you look through the recommendations of 4C that the ETAG is mentioned as a way to address a number of the recommendations. Whatever happens, we want to ensure a policy that balances continual refinement of location accuracy with the cost-benefit trade-offs and the need for public safety and the other stakeholders, so that the resources dedicated to 911 issues are appropriately allocated. On the next slide, it talks about the recommendation is to do not mandate a specific location technology, but promote additional research and development of a variety of those, maybe through an ETAG. We recommend that the FCC provide leadership to ensure that all standards, and Kathy just talked about the standards impacting 911 location accuracy, provide for civic address or geodetic locations to be sent to the PSAPs as the appropriate for the service type. You know, APCO and NENA for many years have advocated federal and state multi-line, if you will, MLTS legislation. It hasn't been widely adopted. It is sporadic, and a recommendation is this: the FCC should support a national MLT legislation. On the next slide, we talk about actively engage in discussion on how to implement a 911 auto location for nomadic VoIP services. Consider extending E911 location obligations to providers of over-the-top VoIP applications that are not subject to interconnected VoIP regulation. Clarify if the existing wireless 911 rules will apply to CMRS-managed IMS-based VoIP services. Moving on, we also talk about distinct location accuracy standards for IMS should not be established at this time, and there's some explanation in addition to that. Clarify how femtocells and unlicensed mobile access, or if you will, UMA devices, should be treated for the purpose of 911. Provide leadership to ensure that all providers, including the new entrants, have appropriate access to MSAG data in order to incorporate it into their business process. This we know and have heard time and again that some of the new entrants have trouble getting Master Street address guide data.
Steve, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but Chairman Janikowski has joined us, and I understand he's on a tight schedule. And if you don't mind just holding off for a few minutes.
Clearly don't
so
mind.
We can have the chairman address us. I'm very happy to have you here, Mr. Chairman.
I did not ask for that interruption. I apologize, but Bob, thank you very much. I see so many friends here and people who know so much about this space that it's it confirms for me what a privilege it's been for the agency for the last 18 months to have this set up with this diverse and committed group of volunteer public servants helping the Commission do its job in this very important area. And I know on this, the final meeting of this iteration of CSRIC, you'll be presenting a series of recommendations flowing out of the work that you've been doing over the year on 911, on EAS, on other issues. We appreciate it very much. I have a background in this space only enough to, be dangerous, as they say, but also enough to really appreciate how important the relationship is between communications and emergencies and first responders. When I was much younger, I was trained and certified as an emergency medical technician, and I did this while I was in college at Columbia, and I participated in a great idea called the Columbia Area Volunteer Ambulance Corps that we set up on campus. The bad idea that I had was to try to make some money working for some private ambulance companies in Manhattan. Well, that was an experience, I'll tell you that. Working with people who just took so much pleasure driving the wrong way up one of the big avenues in New York. But through that and through other work that I've done, I've just developed an incredible appreciation for the challenges of emergency response. As we sit here today and we see what's going on in Japan, we realize, as we've been made to realize before in the last years, Haiti, Katrina, 9/11, etc., how vitally important all of this is. And of course, we all know that it happens every day. There's not a day that goes by without people's lives being saved because of the work that so many of you have done to integrate communications into the work of first responders. And we also know that every day we're not where we should be, and that even more lives could be saved and more could be done if we can harness the technologies that we know are here. And so I want to both celebrate the incredible work that's been done and acknowledge really the heroic efforts of everyone involved in this space to provide true public service to the country every day. And I also want to say that we all recognize the challenge ahead. I can no longer explain to people why they can't text 911. everyone knows, it's changed, right, in the last 2 years. 2 years ago, no one asked. It didn't come up. If you said to someone, hey, what about texting 911, they would have said, well, don't really care. I don't know what to say to people when they say, if I take a photo of someone who just robbed a store, how come I can't just send that right to 911? If I film some video of a building that's been burning that might have some useful information for firefighters, how come I can't just send it to you? And I think we all know that it's a real tragedy that we aren't where we need to be. We understand the reasons why. I think we understand many of the challenges for what we have to do as we move forward with this effort. And I do expect that we'll be rechartering this group that's being worked through by Jamie and the team. But when I come here for the first meeting of the new group, I am going to issue a very strong challenge for us to work together to make real progress on this. For now, let me thank some of the many people who have helped make this a success. Bill Smith from AT&T and Chris Fisher from APCO, who have led this group. These advisory committees are hard, and they're hard for them to have a real impact. In my experience, there are a few things that have to come together for an advisory committee to have the value that people hope it'll have when they get set up. And one is the advisory leadership. Without people who are willing to take time for no money, to try to organize a group into producing constructive recommendations, especially diverse groups like this and a group of this size. It's hard work, and I know it's hard work, and we really appreciate it very, very much. Similarly, we appreciate people like Brian Fonts and Lori Flaherty stepping up. I understand you're chairing this meeting today, is that right? Well, we appreciate that, and I think also the diversity even represented in the four names that I mentioned is just a terrific thing. To have people from NHTSA, from the private sector, from the public safety community, all participating in leadership roles in this is very meaningful, and we shouldn't let that go without notice. Of course, the other thing that's necessary for an advisory committee like this to work is to have the bridges between the committee and the agency built and functioning properly. And it's always much harder than it seems to be because everyone's so busy. Having good communication flows is hard. But it's something that we talk about on the inside, and that I know all of the key leadership staff here who've worked to help coordinate with this committee have taken this challenge very seriously. So Admiral Barnett, I wanted to thank you and Jennifer Manor, Jeffrey Goldtharp and Lisa Folks and the other FCC staffers who've worked to really help make sure that the process proceeds well and leads to actionable recommendations that really help us perform our mission and function as an agency. So with that, again, I just wanted to come by and congratulate you for the terrific work that's been done up to this point. Thank you for it, and to at least open the door for a major topic that I'd like us to take on as we move forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I know Chris Fisher would like to thank you that she's sick and was able to travel, but we appreciate everything that you do and Admiral Barnett does to make this group work. So thank you.
Thank you. Good luck, everyone.
Steve, go ahead.
If we go to the very last slide to conclude, just two topical areas that we thought were worth mentioning. The need for training as we move forward will have to be supported at all levels. And the Work Group 4C just wanted to remind everybody on this panel that the support for that operational and technical training at all levels will really be significant as we move forward. And the other thing is that next gen, and this is kind of restating the obvious, but it kind of will build on what the chairman just mentioned, that it will be a major change to the 911 service, and the adoption of new requirements will take several years, and probably experience suggests to date that unless there's a consensus among government agencies at the local, state, and federal levels, as well as carriers, vendors, and other service providers, next-gen 911 implementation for many PSAPs will be very protracted. So it will take a collective effort such as this and such as the proposals moving forward. I'd be remiss if I didn't say a special thank you to some of the individuals on the Workgroup 4C. Roger Hickson from NENA led our service type subgroup, and Wayne Ballantyne from Motorola led our technology subgroup, and Kathy is with us today and as the document editor and as the individual that kept the group on track, and was a key element. We appreciated her efforts too. It was not an easy effort, but we're happy we were able to arrive at consensus from the group. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Do we have some discussion? Questions, comments? Yes, sir.
I've had some very good conversations with Steve and Craig and Kathy, and I appreciate the constructive dialogue. I will, for the first time for me in this process, be voting against the adoption of this report. I realize I'll almost certainly be the only person voting against the adoption of the report. I think the report is going to be an extremely helpful document. It is one of the most comprehensive looks at all of the different technology, all the different location technologies, and so I'm confident that the report will be very valuable for the commission. The concern is that the report takes some strong policy positions on a number of issues that are actively before the commission in ongoing proceedings right now, issues that my office, that other parts of industry, parts of the internet industry have weighed in on the opposite side of the viewpoint expressed in the report, on issues such as whether the FCC should impose certain 911 obligations on services that ride on top of the internet, over which we believe the FCC does not have jurisdiction, on questions as to whether the FCC should impose technical requirements on devices that can access the internet, again, something we don't believe that the FCC has the authority to do. And so, and I could discuss those issues at great length, but I don't propose to, kind of litigate those issues here. I've filed comments before the commission just 2 weeks ago today on some of these issues, and dating back to 2005 have been actively engaged on these issues. So so while I do think that the report will be very, very helpful for its technical analysis, I'm skeptical that it's appropriate for CSRIC to be weighing in on the policy issues that are in dispute. So my office, I will be voting against the report, but I certainly appreciate Steve and Craig and Kathy's willingness to engage in a good dialogue on these issues.
Thank you. Any other comments or questions? Anybody on the phone have any comments or questions? I'll entertain a motion. Second? All those in favor say aye. Aye. Any nays?
Nay.
Nay. That the motion passes. Thank you.
Well, 4 down and 1 to go, folks. Let's move to the last one, which is Working Group 6, Best Practice Implementation. We have co-chairs of Stacy Hartman from Quest and Steve Malfros with the Federal Reserve Board. I think Steve, Stacy, and Scott Tollefson from USA Mobility will be presenting. Yeah, give them a minute. keep talking.
Hello? Yeah. I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about the important role that telecommunications systems plays in the financial system. The relationship that we have in the banking and financial system with the FCC and the telecommunications industry goes back to the year 2000 conversion. President Clinton formed the President's Council on the year 2000 conversion, and Michael Powell, who was Commissioner Chairman of the FCC at the time, led the telecom sector group. I led the financial sector group, and we worked closely together. Indeed, in that planning, as we discovered the dependency that the financial system has on telecommunications. Indeed, that dependency has only grown over the last 10 years. On this first chart, my goal is not to turn you into bankers in a few minutes, but this first chart is a high-level overview of how the financial system operates. At the end of the day, it's about lenders and investors making money and credit available to borrowers and issuers, for example, issuers of government securities and that kind of thing. And that's done through financial markets such as the New York Stock Exchange and financial intermediaries such as Bank of America. You'll note in this chart at the bottom, critical public utilities and services, that telecommunications is listed first. Indeed, today, when we examine banks, credit unions, and savings and loans, we look at their business continuity plans, and today, interdependencies, number one is telecommunications. Let me just quickly give you a few numbers here. At the level of retail payments today, about 75% of all non-cash payments by consumers in the United States are electronic. Check volumes have been decreasing in the United States at a rate of 7.2% a year. Indeed, even the distribution of cash by ATM machines is growing at less than 1% a year. On the other hand, electronic payments, including debit and credit cards, have been growing at over 9% a year. In 2009, consumers in the United States made some 84.5 billion electronic payments worth $40.7 trillion. Now, let me talk a minute. That's retail level. Let me talk about wholesale level. This is bank-to-bank transfers. One thing that's important to understand in the financial system is that there are two dimensions to money. One is quantity, and the second is velocity, or the rate at which it turns over. Most people that are not in the financial system don't appreciate this. The Federal Reserve, all banks, credit unions, and thrifts have an account with us similar to the account you have with your institution. And throughout the day, debits and credits are flowing electronically through those accounts. Today on FedWire, there are about 500,000 transactions each business day in these bank-to-bank transfers. The value transferred in those 500,000 transactions is about $3 trillion. That means on FedWire today we're doing about $15 trillion a week. Consider the fact that the gross development product of the United States, that is the value of all goods and services produced last year, was about $14.5 trillion. In effect, we're turning the equivalent of GDP over every week on FedWire. Again, this is all based on telecommunications. The next slide, please. I'm not going to get into a great deal of detail here. When I used to teach money and banking, but I shall not, as an adjunct professor, I shall not do that. This is a demonstration of how technology and telecommunications is used in a commercial bank. I would only point out that inside of this box, you would think, oh, those are all in the same data center. They're not. If you were to look at a Bank of America with multiple data centers, many of these inside of the box actually are in other data centers, so the number of links outside of the box on which you depend upon the telecommunications system is much greater. Again, this for purposes of the year 2000 conversion. The person who ran that had us go, we had to go to cabinet meetings and update the cabinet, and we were challenged on one page of paper to demonstrate the size of the year 2000 problem, and this is what I presented to the cabinet regarding communications and telecommunications information systems in a bank. If I can have the next slide, please. How do we define contingency and resiliency? Indeed, in what we ask financial institutions, we expect them to do in business continuity. This is the formula that we use: contingency in depth plus practice equal resiliency. I would add that we apply this to ourselves in the Federal Reserve, indeed as does the Security Exchange Commission, the controller of the currency, the FDIC. You'll notice in this contingency in depth, telecommunications, both voice and data, are critical. If I can have the next slide, please. In the work that we in the financial system have done and did with Chairman Michael Powell, who ran NREC, of course, 6, and I participated in that, in terms of best practice implementation, I thought this quote was very important. The diversity of our industry does not lend itself to the indiscriminate application of a monolithic set of best practices. Rather, NREC best practices are most rapidly and most effectively applied by leaving specific implementation decisions to individual firms. When each company uses its own technical and operational judgment to determine where and when to deploy NREC best practices, network reliability and security are improved, I believe at least cost. This is why we have emphasized in the financial sector that our institutions, whether it's the New York Stock Exchange, the Federal Reserve, Bank of America, etc., that those institutions that represent the financial system work with their telecommunications service providers, and that we have a close interrelationship between our needs for redundancy and resiliency, and that those be conveyed to the industry. And that is this public and private sector, again, relationship that was built and has continued in our work with the FCC and with your industry. With that, let me turn it over to Stacy. Stacy?
Thanks, Steve. Our working group was tasked with identifying the best practices that should be considered critical across communication industry segments. Once we identified what these critical best practices were, then we were tasked with actually pulling together recommendations regarding the methods that accurately and reliably could measure the implementation of those best practices. Next slide. Before we get into discussing the working group's findings and recommendations, though, I would like to take just a moment to really recognize the extraordinary team that was assembled to actually accomplish these tasks. As you can see from this slide, we were lucky to have 24 members that were very active from 19 different organizations. Each of the team members brought an extensive and diverse knowledge to the team that really resulted in the excellent work product that you have in front of you today. From a leadership perspective, Steve and I would like to take an opportunity to thank everybody for their tireless efforts and dedication to our team. Next slide. As I mentioned just a moment ago, we were tasked with looking at all of the existing best practices. In some, there were over 800 that we looked at. In doing that, we also then developed a criteria guideline essentially for rating and ranking these best practices as either critical, highly important, or important. We determined that 114 of these best practices, about 14%, should be considered critical, while 348 should be highly important, and 341 as important. Next slide. Now this is just a snapshot for everybody of one of the attachments to our working report. It is essentially outlining for you some of the work that we've done in categorizing the best practices. We've color-coded them just for ease of use. You can see that the red are the critical, the orange are highly important, and the yellow are important. As well, we've added some notes on the far right column for future use and future CSRICs where you're moving forward some of the work that we're recommending today. Next slide. In addition to categorizing the best practices, our team was also asked to review some 23 best practices that were submitted by the Network Reliability Steering Committee, or NRSC, for CSRIC consideration. Our report recommends that 22 of these 23 best practices be approved today. Right below that, you'll see again another snapshot of the spreadsheet that we've incorporated as another attachment that outlines these best practices. Some of them were modified existing best practices, whereas others were brand new best practices that were brought to us for consideration. Additionally, our report outlines proposals for identifying, contacting, and educating users about best practices and the importance of them. As well, we've incorporated considerations for increasing the utilization of these best practices. I'll now turn it over to Scott Tollefson for reviewing our recommendations. Should be slide 11. We're just waiting for the mic, I think.
Yeah, keep talking so that they can tell where you are.
On these slides follows the numbering in section 5 of the working group's report. Our first recommendation of 16 recommendations is that each organization should make it a priority to evaluate the best practices regularly and should implement those best practices which it deems appropriate for itself. Institutionalizing a review of best practices as part of an organization's recurring planning activities would ensure that the organization is positioned to improve its proficiency and reliability on a continuing basis. Departments that might be given responsibility for these reviews could include risk management, network operations, engineering, compliance, and policy development. Number 2, we believe strongly that implementation of best practices or any form of compliance with them should not be a regulatory mandate for a variety of reasons which are explained in the report. And some of these reasons have been touched on by other speakers today. Of all the reasons, perhaps the most important is that the resource burden to an organization of implementing individual best practices may be substantial, and cost is a significant factor for every organization to consider in determining whether or not implementation will serve the interests of its constituents or itself. Next slide. Number 3, the FCC should continue to endorse the use of best practices by communications organizations. The Commission has a long history of supporting industry's development and utilization of best practices through the previously chartered Network Reliability and Interoperability Councils and Media Security and Reliability Councils. In addition, the Commission has supported the activities and incorporated activities of the NRSC. The FCC should maintain this support. Number 4, some of the best practices should be revised to take into account changes that have occurred in the industry. These changes include development of new hardware and software and modifications in commercial and government policies. Some examples are the many communications modalities currently used by consumers, the evolution of IP-based networks, and the means of facilitating access to 911 services for persons with disabilities. The working group has offered comments on some of the best practices in this regard. We would note that the best practices were developed over the course of many years the ones that we reviewed, that is, were developed over many years by NRIC, and they had not been reviewed or augmented for 4 or 5 years prior to the beginning of this CSRIC's activities. And this is the reason why they need to be reviewed as mentioned in this recommendation. Next slide, please. Number 5, in a related recommendation, the working group recognized that the pace of advancement in communications theory and in system design, fabrication, and operation is accelerating. In order to keep best practice guidance for security and reliability close to the continually evolving state of the art, the best practices should be reassessed and updated not less frequently than every 2 years. Number 6, the best practices that we reviewed did not address concerns arising in the field of communications network interoperability. At the time that these best practices were being developed, neither operators nor regulators were devoting attention and resources to interoperability to the extent that they are today. But given the current policy preference for encouraging interoperability of systems, new best practices should be developed to address the challenges and risks that are presented by these issues. The next slide. Certain risks to the security and reliability of networks have existed in the same form for many years and are well understood. However, emerging risks present great uncertainty and compel fresh assessment. The current best practices should be reviewed and new ones should be created as needed in order to deal with new threats and risks that may be created by persons who use today's knowledge and tools in seeking to disrupt network performance, and with risks and threats that may arise from inherent weaknesses in newer network architecture and equipment. Number 8, we found that the best practices pertaining to E911 performance address interruption in voice transmissions more than interruption in data transmissions. a future CSRIC charter should task a team of experts to modify the existing best practices and establish new ones as needed, relating to avoiding interruption in data transmission, minimizing the duration of any such interruptions, and restoring data service as quickly as possible. Number 9, we also found that none of the best practices pertaining to E911 performance addresses accessibility considerations, gaps, or compliance with the Americans with Disabilities Act. Developing best practices to address these concerns is another task for a future term of CSRIC. This work can take into account the future findings of 2 new advisory committees that were established by the FCC in December to assist the Commission in implementing the 21st Century Communications and Video Accessibility Act of 2010. Number 10, during the current term of CSRIC, other working groups have developed new best practices in their assigned areas, as we've heard this morning. A team of experts should be convened under a future CSRIC charter to reconcile and merge the phrasing and organization of the new best practices with those inherited from the old NRIC and reviewed by Working Group 6. Next slide, please. Number 11. As written, some of the best practices include multiple concepts or do not provide an unmistakable expression of intent. We found that this complicated the process of seeking consensus within our working group on the comparative significance of those best practices, and more importantly, it diminishes their value as sources of guidance to the industry. The working group has offered some suggestions to improve the clarity and utility of some of these best practices. The NRSC guidelines for developing best practices can be used in making these changes. Number 12, based on the data gathered in our benchmark survey and on industry advancements in recent years, it would be beneficial for CSRIC during a future term to reassess the design and operation of both the NRIC and the Bell Labs best practices search engines to determine if they can be refined to deliver better performance. Next slide. Number 13, a web-based tutorial should be developed to help organizations learn about the best practices. Its format should consist of brief training modules. It should be updated annually. It can be developed by experts and hosted by an independent industry organization such as ADIS, CTIA, the U.S. Telecom Association, or a similar group. The FCC should promote the use of the tutorial. A webinar may be another useful tool for training users on the best practices. Though a webinar may be more expensive to develop and present than an automated tutorial, a webinar could be scaled in relation to demonstrated interest of users and to available funding. Number 14, Working Group 6 developed a framework for a white paper to explain the value of the best practices and how to access and use them. This white paper would be the key resource for introducing users to the best practices. It should be prepared by a willing organization such as the NRSC with the FCC's support. The intended readers of the white paper would be executives and others that have responsibility for the activities and facilities addressed by the best practices. This white paper could be distributed at industry conferences and included in mailings that are otherwise being made by the FCC to licensees or by industry associations to their members. Links to the document could appear on the websites of industry groups and the FCC, and it could be emailed to persons listed on licensing records, association membership lists, and publication subscriber lists. Next slide. Information about the best practices should also be presented live at industry trade shows, conventions, and exhibits that are devoted to announcing and marketing new products and services. The sponsors of many of these events are shown on the chart. And finally, our 16th recommendation. As part of the effort to identify ways to educate organizations about the best practices and to encourage their adoption whenever feasible, this working group considered how to help organizations measure the extent of their own implementation of the best practices that have been classified in our report as critical. We decided that a survey is the only mechanism that could deliver statistically valid information about implementation, and so we developed a framework for such a survey, and it appears in the report. The group also recognized that attempting to gather information about use of best practices and about the presence of factors that hamper implementation would be difficult, and that it may not produce the type of data desired. The reasons for those difficulties are described in our report. The working group recommends that the decision whether to proceed with such a survey be made by the members of CSRIC under a future charter. Stacy.
In summary, Working Group 6 reviewed over 800 best practices and categorized them as critical, highly important, or important. We identified approximately 14% of those best practices as critical. As well, we developed recommendations to educate appropriate users about the availability of best practices, to encourage the use of best practices, and to assist with best practice implementation. Today, we're here to recommend to the Council that you approve our report. We'll open it up for questions.
Thank you, Stacy. Any questions for the committee?
Let me just add one comment. Oftentimes, we get asked the net benefit of all of this work around business continuity, resiliency, best practices, and the like. Let me tell you one story. As I mentioned, Michael Powell and I had worked closely together with the industry and with the financial system in preparing for the year 2000 conversion, and indeed focused on resiliency in telecommunications because of the dependency that we have. All of that work paid off on 9/11. The financial system in New York City, despite extensive damage, including to telecommunications, was able to recover and open the following Monday, the New York Stock Exchange. A conservative estimate by my colleagues on Wall Street is, had that work not been done, indeed Wall Street would have been closed for another 2 weeks, and that would have had a significant impact on the United States in loss of confidence in our system, and indeed would have had an impact on the economy and the average people in this country as well. Indeed, what happened on 9/11 demonstrates the value. A number of people have told me that had they known 9/11 was going to occur, they couldn't have done a better job than what in fact happened in preparing, in building resiliency through best practices as part of the year 2000 conversion project.
Thank you, Steve. John, did you have a comment?
Just a very brief comment. Just a very brief comment to say that I did have a good conversation with Stacy and Steve. The Working Group 6 report does raise some of the same tensions with the Working Group 8 report that the 2A report that I discussed earlier, in terms of slightly different, recommendations somewhat in tension. And so I have addressed it earlier, and I don't need to rehash it, but just to note that it's the same concern.
So noted. Thank you. Any other questions or comments? Do I have a motion that we approve this? Second? All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Congratulations. Thanks so much for your work.
This being the last CSRIC meeting of this CSRIC, and in light of the fact that we understand the Commission is likely to charter a new CSRIC, it was suggested that we open the floor here for any discussion of suggestions for how the future efforts might be done better, what's worked, what hasn't worked, and I'm sure that Jeff and his staff from the Commission will be particularly interested in some of those comments. Anybody? Yeah, John.
Oh, what a surprise! Sorry. No, overall, I mean, let me just say personally that I thought that this entire process was extremely well run, and I think that the support that the FCC provided was superb. So certainly I thank you. You know, obviously I have raised a number of concerns about reports today and in previous days. You know, in the ideal world, I would have loved to have participated on all of the working groups, but didn't have the bandwidth to do that. So I would make two related proposals or questions really for you to think about is whether there is a possibility to build into the timetable a little bit earlier review by the CSRIC, the broader CSRIC group. I mean, I think that some of the concerns that I raised, you know, had I been able to see a document earlier while the working group was still kind of a cohesive, working group, instead of having finished the report, could have been fairly easily addressed by, fairly minor word changes just to, address perhaps some of the concerns I raised wouldn't have been, but that would be, be great if that would be possible. And then more broadly, at least in my working group 8, I felt that there would have been value in a brief period of opportunity where we could have asked for broader comment than we were permitted to ask for, and perhaps even by putting it up on a web page where it could be publicly viewable, our draft report. I think that, although obviously we don't want to create a massive public comment process with all the burdens that entails, I would hope that we could find a way, because increasingly the technical decisions that networks make, that cybersecurity decisions, have very significant impact on public interest values and public policy concerns. And so if there's a way that we could allow a little bit more public input into the reports before they're finalized, I think that would be a very beneficial thing.
Any other comments, suggestions? Well, I'll add one that I've heard, and actually will take some of the blame for, is when we developed the various ideas for the work group topics, I'm not sure we took adequate consideration of the fact that there was some overlap, not necessarily in topic, but in potential expertise, and that some of the work groups were hindered by the fact that their worker bees were also worker bees on other work groups. And I think this is probably particularly a problem for some of the nonprofit organizations that don't have as many staff to spread across the work groups. I was kind of pleased to see that the Commission's at the present time thinking of only 4 topics rather than 7 or 10 for the next one, and that is a concern I've heard. Anything else? Well, this time I will not forget to recognize the Chief of the Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau, Admiral Barnett, so he can make some comments.
Bill and to Chris, who's not present, to Bob and Julie before, and Liz, to my right and left, to all our folks. I appreciate the leadership, to all of the working group leads on this. I mean, today is just a confirmation of the tremendous amount of expertise in the room, the hard work. This is something that will benefit the FCC's deliberations in the nation for years to come. You see, we still refer back to previous councils and their recommendations. Your recommendations will be referred to for years to come. So I really do appreciate that. I want to add an additional thank you to Deputy Bureau Chief Lisa Folks, who also has a guiding hand, although sometimes an invisible hand in this. But thank you so much for tremendous work.
Well, thank you, Admiral Barnett. I would like to, as we move into kind of our closing session, I'd like to also add my thanks to all the people you mentioned, and really, literally, to the hundreds of people who have participated in this. This is a fairly large group here, and it seems like a large number of people, but we all know that this is really just scratching the surface of the number of people who do work in this area. And I really hope those hundreds of people fully accept and recognize, maybe, and take pride in the impact of this work. Chairman Janikowski mentioned what's going on in Japan, and you know, having been in and around this type of work for a little over 3 decades now, you know, I can tell you from firsthand experience that anytime there's a disaster, you know, food, water, shelter, and the ability to communicate are the top priorities that a society looks for. And we're seeing that every day in the news in Japan. And I hope that everybody that's participated in this work, regardless of which committee you've been on, you've either felt like you've impacted our ability to make our networks more resilient, or you've impacted their ability to help us respond more effectively to 911, and even as the chairman challenged us today, to look for ways to do it more effectively. The pace of technology is not slowing, and it seems that every time we figure out how to deal with one task, another one comes out at us, and sometimes multiple opportunities come at us. I think the SMS and MMS scenarios that the chairman pointed out today are good ones. Geographic location improvements, not only on the horizontal plane, but on a vertical plane in a multi-story building that has a whole new set of challenges. But I hope that everyone that participates here really takes a great deal of pride that the work you've done here is making society a safer and better place, I think, and I think that, you know, we can't underemphasize the impact that has. I want to particularly thank my co-chair, Chris, and wish her a speedy recovery. Look forward to seeing her again soon. With that, I'll turn the microphone over to Bob for closing comments.
Well, I'll just echo Bill's comments, and you know, I know that Chris would very much like to have been here to thank all of you for your work. Personally, I can say it's been a pleasure working with the AT&T folks as co-chairing the steering committee, and with Anissa, who did a lot of the legwork in terms of keeping us organized. It's been a very good process, and appreciate everyone's help.
And I will add my thanks too. And let me say what distinguishes this CSRIC from even from other NRICs that I've been associated with. I was associated with NRIC 6, NRIC 7, and now CSRIC. And hopefully it's evident to you. It might not have been evident, you know, in the first few months when we were looking at deliverables early on, but I could point to just about everything, not just about everything that you all have done, and see how it relates directly to things that we're doing here. So it is, what you've done is extremely relevant, and it will be used, and it's important. So you've done an incredibly good job. Thank you very much. It's almost cherry blossom time, so I hope, it's too bad you came out a little bit too early for that, but I wish you all a safe journey home. And I'll ask one last thing is keep an eye out for word about the next CSRIC. That should be coming shortly. So thank you very much. Safe journeys home.
Thank you so much for stepping in.